All right, I chose this one in part because I particularly like the emphasis that he gives to the native archaeologists. You have the Choctaw, what was his name, Joe? You have Katrina, who is of the Navajo. Several of the speakers in this video are native archaeologists, and I like that special touch because it does highlight the variety of journeys that we're talking about to populate the Americas. And of course, as we look at the Book of Mormon story, we see three journeys there that we hearken to as explaining something about the origins of possibly some of the people that came here. And yet the evidence by date, the evidence by place makes it quite clear that the Book of Mormon is only a very, very small sample, if that, of the journeys that brought people to this land. All right, so we should be open to the question and answer. I'll do my best to answer any questions that you have, but that really it should be open for discussion this evening. And so please raise your hand, go to the reactions point and raise your hand, and that way Deb can help keep us in line. I'm interested in your overall view on what you think of the video, and then the specific questions and comments as well.
Wednesday, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting documentary. I think it's really important to learn of the history from the people whose ancestors lived it, because it's their story. I mean, people need to be allowed to tell their own stories. I also think that looking for archaeological evidence and pairing that with the evidence with the DNA was really clever. I never thought of the two together, but I can see how they can support each other in coming up with a historical timeline. And I like that the documentary featured Indigenous archaeologists as well, because I think it's important to get the point of view, because they have like the archaeological background and they have the cultural background, which gives them, I think, a very keen perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I agree definitely, and I would add that I was intrigued because when you incorporate the ritual background, the scriptural background, and see the possibilities for how those stories interrelate, I'm reminded of the Claude Lévi-Strauss strategy, which I used in my anthropology classes for teaching about creation, where you take the individual cultural creation account, go through its themes, its synchronic themes, the ones that were in any given telling, and the diachronic themes, the ones that were emphasized time after time after time. And as you look at those themes and then start comparing them from one culture across to another, you discover that that there's often a good deal of overlap, compatibility. And so I'm intrigued by the emphasis that this video gives us on looking at native ritual and trying to find how ritual and spiritual and physical evidences come together.
Okay, Paul, there's a question in the chat. What was the age of people, I believe, buried in Nauvoo?
The earliest people we have here are 2,500 years. We have a canine that takes us back 5,000 years. We have projectile points that take us back to 10,000 years. We have basically there's 10,000 years of almost continuous occupation on this bend in the river.
Okay, thanks. That was for Earl. Monty, go ahead, please.
I'm just looking for a little clarification. Obviously, I have a poor understanding of the word indigenous because they talk about people who came here from a long way back, ran into an indigenous people already here. And I'm sure that in their perspective, there were people here before them even. So who do we call indigenous? Just somebody that was there before us, or is there some sort of timeline that you have to be passed before you're considered an indigenous people in an area?
Interesting question. Anybody want to take a shot at that? I would say generally, Monty, that the people that are perceived to be native born are often identified as indigenous. However, that doesn't last very well in the modern world, where our indigenous people have been displaced to the point that they can't claim the land that was their traditional land. And so, by and large, though, we're looking for indigenous people as the first human inhabitants of a given territory, which means then the video has stretched to Africa and to Europe, to Israel. It's given us 2 million years of possible human indigenous occupation in places. And where we have in the past presumed that America was populated by people that migrated in 10,000 years ago or less, now we're seeing the evidence that shows that where Australian Aborigines got to Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, probably 60. And so they had to travel the ocean to do that. And if the Australian Aborigines were traveling the ocean to get there 50,000 years ago, then that certainly postulates the possibility of indigenous people coming to the Americas very early as well. So the fact that the tribal peoples, by and large, see themselves as having originated here gives them a particularly good claim for being indigenous.
Sounds like a very imprecise term.
It is. Yeah, one of the difficulties here is whether you should call them first Americans, but American traces back to Amerigo Vespucci, and so here you're dealing with a European influence again. Other possibilities include the natives, Paleo Indians, the Amerindians. These are all terms that are used by various archaeologists and historians. And it is confusing, and there is no really good answer on that yet, because we don't actually know who the first inhabitants of the Americas were.
Okay, well, thank you.
LD, go ahead. Please unmute.
I would recommend that all who are in the area in North America have fairly easy access to Cahokia. If you have not been there, it's within sight of St. Louis, Missouri. If you've not been there, go. The museums there, the artifacts, the pyramids are fascinating, and the history of the city. It was the largest in the Americas at one time, and at that time it was also larger than London or Paris. It's a fascinating place. It's easy to get to, and I would recommend, if you're at all interested in history, that you visit there.
Thank
I
you.
would second that, LD. Thank you. I had the privilege of working as an archaeologist at Cahokia for a while, and the irony was that well, if you're standing on Monk's Mound and looking to the north and west, you'll see an even greater mound, which is the trash dump from St. Louis. And I had the privilege of excavating for the expansion of that trash dump to try to salvage everything that we could from the Cahokia period to make it so that that could be put in the museums. And what a fascinating shadow to be under, to see here I was working under the trash dump of St. Louis, which was many times larger than Monk's Mound, which is 1,000 years old, but one of the largest mounds in the Americas. But I agree. It's one of the best preserved, one of the more fascinating. Very sadly, St. Louis was known as Mound City. And so what we have on the Illinois side is but a small microcosm of what was really on the west side of that river, and has been covered over by the modern civilization.
Okay, Val Larson, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think for those of us who are gathered here tonight, who are mostly believers in the Book of Mormon, the challenge is to figure out how do the people in the Book of Mormon interact with these people who are clearly already there. So how do they show up in the Book of Mormon, if at all? So people have, scholars have struggled with this in various ways, but I think that is the challenge for all of us here, if we do believe in the Book of Mormon. I think the evidence is overwhelming that there were other people. And how did the Book of Mormon authors, how do they reflect that existence of others? I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that, but that's been a big issue for scholars.
It's a particularly big issue, Val, and thank you for bringing that up. But it's a big issue because we have so many difficulties in triangulating the place names and so forth from the book into an actual geographical location. Mesoamerica probably works best, but there's still some very serious problems there. Lamani would be a close placing approximate to Lamoni, King Lamoni, but there's such a paucity of place names that carry across to make it so that's very difficult. And while you do have some good chronological correlation between the Olmec and the Jaredites, there's an awful lot of differences there as well. And so to be honest about it, while I think that the Mesoamerican fit is probably better than most, we have a strong inclination among some to push us into the heartland theory. South America gets a good push by Brother Potter. We had the Olson theory about Malaysia. One possibility that I think ought to be considered is that the Book of Mormon is telling the story of the journey, of the allegorical journey, more than a specific one. Because it seems to me that everyone is entitled to a promised land. And the Book of Mormon basically is encouraging people in the human family to get beyond the dysfunctionality of our wars and conflicts, to learn to live together in peace and learn to reach the promised land of peace that is the promise if we only learn to embrace it.
Hello, thank you, guys. Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, just a comment kind of on following up on Val's. Of course, I do work mostly Mesoamerica, but one of the issues is, it doesn't seem like any of the names at all in the Book of Mormon have any link to indigenous Native American First Nation languages in terms of, phonetics or anything. But one explanation for that, and I think we're kind of told that in the Book of Mormon, is these names are really calques, meaning they're taking the meaning of the other name and putting it in their own language, which is pretty common in Mesoamerica to do that. And maybe it was up here in North America too, I don't know. And so that's kind of one of the things that has puzzled people, but I think that seems to be the answer that we're finding out. And then also knowing that, like I think I mentioned before, layman, that word actually in the Bible is found to mean unbeliever. So they were just kind of classifying anybody that wasn't a believer, into this big group, which could have included all kinds of different people. I did work on a book, Order of Nehor in Mesoamerica. What I was trying to do there is take the other, the beliefs that we know from those that were not of that Nephite tradition and I compared it to the Maya and actually found pretty much a lot of correlation between the belief system of the Maya. So, again, we've had to take a major shift in the past 50 years that it's not talking about a very large area. It's very small. They were kind of interlopers, if you will, initially. And then, of course, we know that from the text, because if you understand the Lamanites as everybody else, it said they lived among the Lamanites, and Lamanites were always more higher population than they were. So anyway, so I think that, I don't know that it's a challenge per se. I think it actually helps us to understand better the Book of Mormon when we understand kind of what's going on with the external populations, right? Because some things just didn't make sense. Like you have the Zenith group going over, back to land of Nephi, and very shortly there's this basically a religion that does some sort of synchronization. I mean, it doesn't follow the old time Nephite religion. It's mostly because we know there are other people there. They had remained there. They were able to replace their priests. All of a sudden, they had people that were already priest level to replace the original priests that Zenith had set up. When Noah came in. So I don't know. I mean, just some comments there related to that issue.
Thank you for your comments. I think they are helpful.
Okay, Wednesday, go ahead, please.
So coming from someone who wasn't born into a restoration tradition, but rather someone who converted to it, when I approached the books of scripture, I did not approach the Book of Mormon as if it were a historical document. And I think some of this was, and in fact, what attracted me to Community of Christ was that I did not have to think of scripture as historical. I could think it's inspired by God. I can think there's important lessons in it that we need to learn. I can think it's indispensable, but I don't have to think that it is actual history. And when I approached the Bible that way, but I approached the Book of Mormon in a way that almost like parables, but it's because it was because before I had even began reading it, I had chanced upon First Nations people talking about the importance of them being the ones to tell their history. And so it's something that I always want to be cautious of. And so I have difficulties equivocating the events of the Book of Mormon happening in the Americas from what I understand, there isn't backup from Indigenous people confirming that. So when I approach the Book of Mormon, I approach it as like a 19th century document. But I think that helps me sometimes with interpreting it, because I can think about how it's applicable to me as a modern piece of scripture that was dealing with a lot of the things that we're dealing with at the time. So yeah.
Good going, Wednesday. Good thinking.
Okay, Terry Walker, go ahead, please.
What I'm going to relate to is the gospel according to Terry, but some of it's factual. The connection between indigenous peoples in the Americas and Book of Mormon peoples really doesn't have any, there's no need to understand the connection between the two, because the Book of Mormon is for us to learn from in our day and age. as well as to help the peoples that are descendant from the Book of Mormon peoples. And that is very much like the Bible. Adam, for example, was born into basically what archaeologists call a civilized world. He wasn't born as a Neanderthal and whatnot. Civilization had developed by the time he was put into the world of Earth. And so that story of Adam and on down to Abraham and our descendancy to Abraham is for a purpose, to help us get back to our Heavenly Father. And so it's a very similar story to the Book of Mormon, and that some of the peoples that are fringe aren't really part of that story. And so in a way, it doesn't matter if we know who they are and that sort of thing, even though my background is archaeology. And so I like to know who's where and what, but I understand the religious part of it also. And that's in a way a more important factor than the historical part. So.
But Terry, I'd like to point out that my DNA includes significant amount of Neanderthal background.
A lot of
So
people's does.
I would like for us to consider the possibility that Adam was a Neanderthal, or at least carried a significant chunk of those genes.
Obviously he did, yes.
All right.
Okay, James Lucas, please, go ahead.
This is a question. I'm glad to hear that we have two archaeologists and maybe more on the call here, because I'm picking up I believe it was the Navajo professional archaeologist who made this comment, but I may have missed that, or maybe it was somebody else who said it. But the comment was made that the studies of archaeology and DNA and so forth were something that, and I'm sorry if I'm now repeating it, even though it was only a few minutes ago that I heard it, if I'm repeating it incorrectly, but she made a comment basically along the lines of, we need to tell our own origin stories, even and you know, the archaeology and the DNA and the other scientific evidence can enrich or be compatible with or be parallel with. Can't remember the exact expression that she used, but the idea that I got was that the first origin stories of the Native Americans, we'll use that term, actually were sometimes seen to be in conflict with the scientific research. So my question is there resistance to modern scientific research on Native American origins from Native American groups who feel that this detracts from their traditional origin stories that are part of their cultural heritage? Or was I kind of reading too much into her comment?
Barry, you want to jump on that first?
You're muted.
You're on mute, Terry.
There we go. Okay. One comment is for example, the story that they told about the origin of people came from the turtle and the mud put on the turtle's back and that formed the land, etc. That's sort of way beyond any archaeological evidence or any way to study it. So you have to take that origin story at their face value, because there's no way to prove or disprove it. And a lot of origin stories are that way. And so you have to respect them and accept them for what they believe and go from there.
Is there active resistance to the scientific perspective from some Native American groups because scientific story is perceived as not compatible with the traditions of the groups?
That I don't know. One thing I do know is my archaeology is mainly centered from southeastern Utah and the Anasazi. And in talking with Navajos about the Anasazi, one good friend I had that was Navajo said, it doesn't matter what the archaeologists say, we know where we came from. And, you know, you have to accept that for their beliefs.
Mhm.
I would respond slightly differently. I don't know about the resistance to scientific approach, but I am aware that there is a great deal of appreciation that what they have put forward and what the scientists have put forward says that the Earth is not now as it has not always been the way it is now. And because we look at the significant changes over the history of the Earth, then somehow we fit into that. And we recognize there's different interpretations of how to make that story best fit. But the journey of all of us is a journey that has seen many of these same themes. And for example, the flood theme is one that shows up in a large majority of the cultures. The idea of a woman being highly significant to the origin is another of those common themes. So if you start just looking for the commonalities between the First Nations or around the world creation accounts, then you'll find the scientist who speaks of evolution is saying that the world has changed. We are in a constant change, and the Maya would tell us that we've had 4 worlds pre-existing. The idea of where we have come from, though, is part of that human journey, and so scientists are just a little bit like the tribalists, holding on to their story and advocating that it's the one that's best. It may be, but I think we get a better one if we put all of the themes together and see the orchestration of our human development.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your perspective. That's very interesting.
Good question.
Val, go ahead, and then Jerry will be next.
The Anasazi, I spent 2 years as a missionary on the Navajo Indian Reservation. I learned their language years ago. Anasazi, as I recall, means ancient enemy. So built into their language is a sort of relation to these folks, a hostile relation to the Anasazi. I think the one can certainly approach the Book of Mormon as Wednesday does, as I understood from her comment, as a kind of myth, and myths are really important. There's no question that myth, and this is in Levi-Strauss. You mentioned Paul Levi-Strauss. He respected myth, and anthropologists normally do respect myth. They give meaning to people's lives. They're obviously functional and deeply important in how people live their lives. But it makes a lot of difference in how one reads the Book of Mormon, whether one thinks of it as a 19th century myth, or I mean, it certainly functions as a myth in the sense of shaping and giving meaning, but whether one thinks of it as a product of the 19th century or as an ancient work, and it could even be, well, I'll give you one way where it matters a lot is Matthew Bowen does a lot of work with the Book of Mormon where he looks at the sort of Hebrew roots of words and Old Testament roots of all kinds of practices, and he adds a lot of depth and insight based on that set of assumptions, and so do a lot of other people. So if you approach the Book of Mormon as an ancient work and you think that it has deep historical roots in the Middle East and the practices of the Jews in 600 BC and before, that really affects all kinds of dimensions of meaning in the text. And so the people who approach it that way end up with quite different understanding of what the text is doing and what it's saying than somebody who thinks of it as a 19th century book. So this question of whether it's history or not matters a lot. And I mean, one could say, in a sense, the same thing about Christ. I don't think it's not as important of a question whether the Book of Mormon is historical or not as whether Christ is historical or not. But there are people who say they're Christians who don't think Jesus rose from the dead, and it matters a lot whether one believes he did or didn't. The history question is not inconsequential. I think that's true for the Book of Mormon too. Christ is a lot more important than the history question about the Book of Mormon, but these issues, I think, do have purchase, do matter for how we engage with the book and what it means to us.
I would like to emphasize that in my anthropological training, I came to understand that myths are true. They will be true to their culture. They will be true to the belief system that they're derived in. Look, for example, at our treatment of George Washington. The things we teach our kids about George Washington are myths, about his being a great general, about his being the first president, about his wooden teeth, chopping down the cherry tree. Those are all significant stretches of the actual history if we go back and look at it carefully. So, but they all serve us because we clearly would much prefer to be celebrating first president of the United States who was an honest and nice guy, not somebody who died from pneumonia for messing with a slave girl.
Jerry Grover, go ahead, please. Unmute, please.
Yeah, kind of in a follow-up to James' question to the archaeologist. I'm a geologist, so I've actually had a lot of opposition from most groups to origin stories, including the Christian community. So I would suspect archaeologists are the same, meaning it's probably not unique to the native population here, just like all over the world. When you're looking at, archaeological history, just like geology, you end up encountering inconsistencies, right? So I don't know that Native American it may be different in its approach, but it's probably not really unique in terms of science encountering these, origin stories. So I don't know whether you've encountered, I guess both of you have just mostly involved in North American archaeology. So, but I suspect like the biblical archaeologists also run into some issues.
I would certainly agree. There's room for disagreement.
Yeah, and my approach also on the myths, I mean, even like the flood myth, for example, there is like some evidence that the origin stories are not like without basis. It's sometimes they've been built on and, incorporated into the culture. So I've always kind of respected them, that there probably is maybe a science, some explanation, some root or something, kind of like dragons, look to be a response to finding dinosaur, fossils. Giants, are response to like large, like in Mesoamerica, the Tula statues and the Olmec colossal heads seem to be the genesis of, because those later civilizations looked at those and kind of looked at giants. So what I'm saying is I actually respect the origin stories that, number one, you have to understand them probably in order to do effective archaeology, because you have to understand what you're going to be finding in relation to them, whether it's, artistic representation or, you know what I'm saying, those kinds of things. I just know Mesoamerica, if you don't understand the twins and all these other things, you're not going to understand anything that you're excavating, at least where you're encountering religious elements. So anyway, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Jerry. Terry, go ahead, please.
To go along with what Jerry and Paul said, one thing that I remember being taught at college, and I don't remember what class it was in. It most likely was an archaeology or anthropology class, but the teacher said that myths are based on a fact. Now, at present, we don't understand that. We don't understand the people that have created that, and they don't understand it, but they believe it, and that's part of their culture. And so, you can take that for what it's worth, how it started and whatnot, but myths are based on a fact, from the past.
Interesting way to look at that. Americans tend to perceive ourselves as the greatest civilization that the world has ever seen. And you can measure that in terms of the remarkable technology we have developed for being able to kill people. Because looking back in the Paleo period, one person with one weapon could kill one person. It wasn't until the development of gunpowder that people were able to kill more than one person with a single shot. By World War I, we had bombs that could kill 20 or 30 people with a single shot. So look how much more civilized we've become. And then the Americans ultimately get to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where we can kill 250,000 people with a single shot. So clearly we're the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. I didn't mean to put a silencer on the discussion.
Well, those were firecrackers compared to what we have now.
Oh, my phone's. Sorry.
So
Says
go ahead.
I have three hands raised, but I can't see anybody. Where are you? Okay, Wednesday, sorry.
No problem. That's a good point. I think it's what people, I think the culture that the people are coming from determines what they think makes a society great. And so it's really a subjective question. Like so in my opinion, I wouldn't necessarily consider America a great country, but that's just because of the history my people have with this country. So I think when people are, if you value wealth, you might say, things have progressed, but if you, value maybe harmony with the environment, you might think that things have gotten worse. So I think it's a matter of perspective and what the society, what the people in the society value.
Thank you, Wednesday. Jerry, go ahead, and then James Lucas.
I was just going to comment on Paul's comment. Like the Book of Mormon is actually has that kind of too, meaning there is kind of a superiority of military. I mean, a lot of military things are going on in the Book of Mormon, right? And so they do Moroni is a great person because of his military prowess and also his faithfulness and other things, Mormon as well. So it's kind of interesting how that concept, I don't know, is all that unique culturally. It seems like a lot of histories of peoples considered, they were always trying to increase their capabilities of warfare. So kind of interesting.
Okay, James Lucas, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay, here we go. Just to carry forward the discussion here on myth, very much appreciate the perspective that Terry and Paul, Terry, right? Yeah, Terry and Paul have expressed of showing respect for the myth in the kind of with a capital M, if you will, the received cultural tradition of various peoples about their origins. And if I heard you correctly, basically being willing to consider them as sort of in parallel with, or as put him into a larger perspective with the scientific, modern Western scientific perspective. I would make a observation here, though, that it's interesting that while we express that support and acceptance toward the traditional beliefs of other peoples, of indigenous peoples, not just in the Americas, but many other places and so forth, and are kind of willing to stand aside and not beat them over the head with our DNA and archaeology and theories and approaches of Western cultural scientism. It's interesting that in our own culture, our own Western culture, traditionally, that respect has not been extended to our, capital M myths. In other words, there is in our culture, or our Western, European culture, a long history of a great deal of hostility. And, it's two-way. I'm not saying it's just on the part of scientists. There's religious people have certainly done their share on the other side of the divide. But nonetheless, it's striking to me that in our own culture, there is a strong tradition on the scientific side of anti-Christian and anti-religious, anti-biblical perspective on the on the scholarship. So while you may, and I respect this enormously, say, the Navajo have this tradition about where they came from, and when I go digging in the ground, it maybe suggests this other thing, but hey, we'll live with both. That's lovely, but you do not get that from modern archaeologists digging in the Middle East who say, no, the Bible, there's no evidence that there actually was an Exodus. This is all just fairy tales. The Bible's fairy tales. I mean, I've heard, reputable Israeli archaeologists say that and say it with some vehemence. And of course, as I said, this is a long tradition in the West amongst, the European peoples. This conflict has been going on for centuries. And we see it today. I mean, literally within the last week, I saw a person attacking the Book of Mormon on the grounds that the Book of Ether seems to take the story of the Tower of Babel seriously, and therefore the Book of Mormon is false, because obviously the Tower of Babel is false, is a false story. So we carry it over into our own immediate concern here. So I'd be interested in anybody's reaction to that. That's more of an observation than a question to anyone. But this has always struck me that the same people who often say, "Oh, I respect indigenous people's origin stories and beliefs," disrespect their origin stories and beliefs of their own civilization, of their own cultural heritage. That was my comment.
Yeah,
Sorry for going on and on.
Thanks, James. Paul, you want to respond, or anybody?
But let me respond just a little bit there. I'm intrigued with the parallel because my wife grew up in the sandwich between her mother, who came from the empire builders, the warriors, and her father, who came from the peaceful Polynesians, the people who said, "Harimai tama, come and eat with us, and we'll become friends and family." And so, if you grow up in the sandwich between those two people, those two cultures, those two orientations, what does that do to you? It puts you in a very interesting position of making some choices. And in our society, I earlier gave emphasis to the choice that we've made toward being able to kill people. Let me go on the other side, because we also carry the myth of our being the promised land. And we still are struggling with that. Just to what extent is America the land of promise? And we're haggling over our borders at this stage and having a hard time trying to figure out just to what extent we can be part of the promised land. And yet the Book of Mormon story clearly is focused upon that as a fundamental human theme. So I'm sort of talking around your comment, James, but I appreciate that our use of mythology tends to be self-serving. People put together the mythology to replace history and to reinforce the themes in life that they want. Fortunately for me, my wife chose the more peaceful theme.
All the same thing can be said of history, though, of what you just said about mythology. There's all kinds of different histories, and interests clearly undergird the writing of history as well as myth.
I would see history as mythology.
Well, I'm glad, Paul, that she picked that side, since I am going to guess that the DeBarthes were descendants of maybe some Norman conquerors and other warrior type peoples.
Yep. They're among the people that wiped out the Neanderthals. But the Neanderthals got their revenge, and so left some genes behind.
Okay.
Okay, Wanda, you're first, and then Wednesday will be next. Go ahead, please, Wanda.
Okay, in the
Thank you.
beginning of this video, I happened to hear the word turtle. And I wondered if anyone else associated that with the Book of Mormon review I gave on the Cry of the Ancients. And the fact that my friend Princess Little Pigeon was of the Oneida tribe, but she was of the Turtle clan. And she claims that that was what was coming out of the mouth of the serpent in the Serpent Mound. So I wondered if anyone else made that connection, and I wondered which group was it that said something about the turtle in this video. Does anybody remember?
I believe that was Dr. Eldon Yellowstone. I don't remember what his cultural affiliation was, but
Yeah.
The story of the turtle with the muskrats bringing the dirt up on its back, and also shows up in a dozen different First American myths, and so therefore the land of the great turtle is one of the expressions for North America in particular.
And you remember in that book report that Clara claimed that the clan was much more important than the actual tribe, because a lot of the tribes were related, and the turtle was considered to be their clan name. And she said that people who came by water in 600 BC were fringes because that indicated the waves of the ocean. And so at least the first people in her tribe considered it to be a history book for her people to recall to them what they believed when they first came over. And that was from Jerusalem. So they even wore some of the Hebrew phylacteries or whatever they called them on their heads with the 10 Commandments in them. And they found those all over the United States, I guess. So that was the only comment I wanted to make.
Well, thank you for bringing us back to that one, because
Yeah.
I think the Gray Owl and Little Pigeon story is a very interesting one. And again, would call people's attention to that book because it is a First Nations account that I think is quite instructive.
Actually, I was without electricity until just before the meeting, and that's why it took me so long to get my sound back on, because everything went off for 5 hours. And I finally realized that I hadn't turned the speaker back on. So I'm glad
you were able to connect
hear you
with us.
finally. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Wanda. Wednesday, go ahead, please, and then Jerry.
So this is to James on the ways that researchers may react to myth in their own culture versus in another. With another culture, they don't really have that experience. They haven't had a chance to have negative experiences with it. Something that I guess is in their usual realm, the realm they grew up with. And so I think it's easier that way than say someone who grew up and, really believed in something and then found some evidence that it wasn't true. And now they're really upset. They feel betrayed or lied to. And then so they're going to deride the myth because maybe it was placed to them as the ultimate truth and they feel betrayed. I've heard that sort of stuff from people who are angry. So I passed it along.
Thank you, Wednesday.
Thank you. It's an interesting point. Yes.
Jerry, go ahead, please, and then Monty.
Yeah, kind of responding to James. One of the things, I don't know if the archaeologists observed the same, but among the geologists, I mean, I would say most are atheists anyway. They would never entertain any belief in any God of any culture. So you're asking, do they respect our myth? I don't think a lot of them respect any myth, at least to the extent that it involves divine anything. So maybe Paul can respond. Archaeologists, I interface with some, but I interface more with geologists. So
I agree with that.
Yes, I would agree generally that our archaeologists tend to be not particularly religious people. But again, as we see more and more archaeologists coming out of the First Nations peoples, then I think we may have to do some revising there. And we have people like Josh Gailey and Terry and myself who are here at espousing some religious philosophy along with our archaeological philosophy. So somehow we tie it together.
yeah. Or a lot of them, at least LDS, Utah branch, whatever you want to call it, the ones I interface with that are scientists, they really can't talk about it in their field, or they, are discounted or ridiculed. So geologists don't care so much, but
I was interested. Ray Matheny was one of my best contacts with the LDS archaeologists, and he was he was far more of a scientist than he was a religious person. And well, when he, for example, he turned in his report on the altar of Adam at Adam on the Amun, and showed that it was actually a late woodland monument that was only 1,000 years old. That didn't quite go along with what the church was expecting him to produce, and so that sort of got buried. And so it's one of those things we just don't talk about. But I noticed that when he died, he was a member of the LDS Church, and of course, they kept him in good measure that way. I think perhaps because he was famous for his good archaeology work.
Paul, he was also proud when he got his DNA thing that he had Neanderthal ancestry.
Yeah, we shared that. Yeah, we shared that. Made us brothers.
Okay, we got 3 people in the queue. Bill, I know you're there. I'll get you in just a minute. So we got Monty first and then Terry. Please, go ahead, Monty.
Okay, I just think that we're very cavalier when we throw around the words like myth and fantasy, because, well, it might be considered more prophetic situation than something about the past, but you know, when we consider myth being something that's impossible, we've learned our lesson about that, because so many of the things that we have today would have been pure myth, a long time ago. In fact, it would have been downright magical. But I think that when you get started on the subject of what's mythological and what isn't, it's very difficult to get sidetracked into areas where most of us just don't have that kind of expertise to figure out, how much is, how much isn't, and that type of thing is one of the things that makes it interesting to study. But people get it wrong all the time. I mean, like, you ask somebody what myths are, and they say, well, for instance, take vampires. And I just tell them, no, that's only half right. And they have to say, well, what's that? And I said, well, only the girl vampires are myths. The boy vampires are mythers.
Thanks for your input, Monty. That's greatly appreciated. Okay, Terry and then Bill.
Okay, I've got 2 things and I'll be quiet. The comment earlier about clans, and that's very true in a lot of non-Western societies, that the clan is more important than anything else. For example, among the Navajo, you can't marry into a certain other clan. Only there's a certain group of clans can you marry into. You can't marry into the other. It was probably similar to Paul's wife coming and father coming from 2 separate entities like that. But anyway, my main comment is that in history and archaeology, time changes a lot of things. It just takes a lot of time for things to change. And that's what our life is all about, basically.
Okay, Bill, are you still on? It's your turn.
Okay,
There
can you
are.
hear me?
Yep.
All right. Wednesday, you're a remarkable person. You're a thinker. I appreciated what you said.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm a retired writing teacher. And I taught college writing for a long time. But to reconcile the Book of Mormon with the video that we saw, we have to consider the purpose of the Book of Mormon. It was to tell the story of the Israelites coming to America and their relationship with the higher power. And so in order to do that, you have to focus on that purpose. Now, there are other things going on also, as we saw from the video, but they were irrelevant to some extent to the purpose of the Book of Mormon. That kind of it's in harmony with what Wednesday was getting to, I believe. Yeah, we don't focus on the history of the Book of Mormon as being the history of the early civilization, but rather on the purpose of the Book of Mormon itself. Okay. Did you
Thanks,
follow
Bill.
what did you understand what I was trying to say? Deb?
Think so?
Huh?
Yep, I
Okay,
believe
Deb.
so. Okay, Val, go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is partly, Bill, this is a response to what you were saying. You were sort of propounding a theory of the text, and people have lots of different theories about what the Book of Mormon is. And how it functions in people's lives is to some extent separable from those theories, but not entirely separable. So what counts as a problem that someone's working on in the Book of Mormon is often rooted in the theory they have for the text. And if you think it's historical, then that creates a bunch of different problems people are trying to work with. If you think it's not historical, some of those problems immediately disappear. I'll give you one example. There's an article in the Interpreter right now, which is an online journal. It writes a lot on the Book of Mormon. It's available for free. Anyone that wants to go look at it. There's one of them that is talking about the problem of the mark that and the curse and the mark and the stuff that it talks about there. Now, if you think of the Book of Mormon as a 19th century work, you have to say Joseph Smith was, in the context of his time, a liberal on racial questions. I mean, his attitude toward Native Americans was way more generous than the average person's attitude was at the time. So he was trying to incorporate, see Native Americans as part of the religious community, as God's children, as having a special place and special blessings from God. So read as a 19th century work, it's a generous text. If you read it as a historical work that is a revelation from God and that Mormon was a prophet, then you got a different kind of problem you got to deal with. And this one article is trying to deal with this question of God, what is this mark? If we think of it as race, that's really problematic for us religiously and culturally now. So the one person is arguing that it is what they had was actually a tattoo that discolored the skin, and that was a violation of the Old Testament covenant, where the Jews and the Hebrews there were forbidden to put on tattoos, and that became a mark of their separation from the covenant community. Now, why is somebody putting that forward? Because this is somebody who takes the Book of Mormon as history seriously. We don't find it acceptable nowadays to say that someone's skin color could be a curse or in any way reflect moral standing or as a consequence of some sort of moral act. And so these folks that hold the Book of Mormon to be historical, and this is not the only person who's dealt with this. A lot of people try to find alternative explanations within the context of the Old Testament for the idea that the curse of blackness or whatever, that is an alternative to the idea that it has something to do with race. So the kinds of problems that people are working on and how the text is functioning in their lives is heavily rooted in whatever theory they have about what the Book of Mormon is. And depending on what view you take of what the Book of Mormon is, you face completely different kinds of problems, and you have to deal with the rhetoric of the text in very different ways. So these baseline assumptions about the nature of the text are really consequential for how we engage with the Book of Mormon as a text.
How we engage the Book of Mormon as a text. Yeah, we have our own, we seek to have our own spiritual affirmation of it by reading Moroni 10 chapter, and wow, it happens for many of us that we do get our own affirmation. And yet look at all the differences that we have once we have all those unique affirmations. I'm intrigued by the Navajo position. We've had the Navajo generally surround, or do completely surround, the Hopi reservation. And the Hopi tradition is much more peaceful. And they speak of 4 periods of creation in which, well, in one of the early periods, the people were starving, and so the ant people fed them, and that's why the ants have such small waists even today. But in the last coming forth out of the 4 corners, the idea of people being able to come into a world where people learn to live together in peace was paramount. But the tablet that came out with the instructions of how to do that got broken. And the Hopi have a part of that tablet, and the white man has the other part. But the white man, because he has accepted the palakas, the lies that came along with the broken tablet, and until that tablet comes back together again, we will continue to have to work through our conflicts and our differing mythologies. But once we learn to read the code and follow it, then we can learn to be people of peace. And that's rather a striking understanding from people who are the one of the longest term survivors in their own homeland in the American history. Their Hammurabi goes back more than 1,000 years. But the idea that these people are largely surrounded by, and their reservation has been constricted by the Navajo, puts an interesting tug and pull there. Wednesday has her hand up, and so let me be quiet.
No, it was something that you said that reminded me of something that just came over my head a couple of hours ago. I was sitting upstairs, and the words that popped into my head, like, "Be ye agents of Moroni's promise." And I just wanted to share that with you all. I'm not exactly sure what it means exactly, or like, I feel, because like when I see the truth to share, I feel like the truth is something more complex than historicity of the plates. But it just seems in tune with something that we're talking about tonight. So excited to share it.
Thank you.
Okay, Jerry Grover, go ahead, please. Are you unmuted there, Jerry?
Yeah, kind of my comment a little bit to Wednesday was that partially kind of this class or whatever we do, sometimes we get kind of in the weeds, I would say, on Book of Mormon things. I think we all have larger spiritual beliefs and beliefs in, that aren't necessarily tied to some detail in the Book of Mormon. Just wanted to comment on that. And then I just kind of had a question. I'm from the Utah tradition, LDS. Going kind of back to the original video, maybe Paul or somebody else from the Community of Christ, or if there's other Reformation branches here represented, how did they approach Adam and Eve, age of the earth kind of thing, doctrinally or whatever? I'm just not familiar too much with that. I don't know.
Well, Blair has his hand up and he would be a good person to try that, I think.
Well, I have my own position on the Adam and Eve situation, but I'm not going to worry about it. Basically, to me, the Bible's got a story to tell. The Book of Mormon has a story to tell. I happen to believe that both of them are based in general on history, but that isn't why I stuck my hand out. I don't have any serious difficulties because I know there are so many questions that I can't answer, but I don't mind that because I don't know it all. and I'm not going to try and pretend that I do know it all. But the reason that I raised my hand was that I've been working on a presentation about the Chinese characters and how the story of Genesis runs through those Chinese characters. And I'm about ready to give that, and I would like to have a date to make that presentation.
I believe we have a date starting on June 12th.
I will take that date. June 12th. Okay, and you can entitle it Genesis in Chinese.
All right, Genesis in Chinese. Very good.
Be careful, I know Mandarin.
Good. I'm only going to give a book report. Of this book. I'm going to tell you what's in this book in general.
What's the name of it?
The Discovery of Genesis. The Discovery of Genesis by C.H. Kong, that's K-A-N-G, and Ethel R. Nelson. This is dated 1979. And I had this book with me when I went to China in 1984, just after they opened up the China to tourism. And it has colored an awful lot of what I have presented in the forum here. So I'll tell you what this book says about
Right.
the book of Genesis in Chinese characters.
Technical question for Blair. I just put in the chat what I did receive as title of the book and the author, but can you confirm that this is correct? Or
Okay.
put the right title and author in the chat, please, Blair.
Blair, is the title of the book, The Discovery of Genesis?
Yes.
And it's by Khan, K-H-A-N?
K-A-N-G.
Oh, Kang,
Kang.
K-A-N-G.
I'm not gonna argue.
I like your new background, SP.
Deborah, put it in the chat, please.
It's there.
I'm saying
Okay.
I like SP's new background.
I didn't understand, Monty.
He's saying that he
Oh,
likes
I'm saying
Ashby's
he's got a
background
new
tonight
background.
Oh,
with the flowers and the waterfall.
that's Aspie's background, not
Right.
mine.
Yeah, he's liking that.
Mine's in my workroom. All right.
You guys have all got books everywhere. You fellas are smarter than me. You got I have to tell myself, well, I'm not completely dumb. I owned a book once.
Well, you can get this book, and there are a couple of others that Ethel Nelson has been involved with. I've got two of them here. One is God's Promise to the Chinese by Ethel Nelson. And another one is Genesis and the Mystery Confucius Could Not Solve. They're all about essentially the same thing. But the one I'm going to give you is in Chinese characters today, how the book of Genesis is in Chinese characters today. And these others are in the old runes, scratched on bone and so on, that they have found similar markings that convey the story of Genesis.
Well, while Blair is inviting us to make preparations for his forthcoming, I would like to invite Wednesday to consider introducing our speaker next week, since I am having these computer difficulties. If you would care to do that, I would appreciate it, Wednesday, since I may not have contact with you otherwise.
Okay.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Blair, it sounds like your author there is trying to do something for the Chinese that's sort of similar to what the Book of Mormon does for the indigenous people of the Americas, to anchor them in the Judeo-Christian tradition in some way, or connect them in a fundamental way to that tradition. Because the Book of Mormon, at least one thing that it does or claims to be doing, is linking the people that lived in the Americas into the narrative of the Bible, connecting them to the Bible.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. This Kong is a Christian minister in China. And he discovered that the basic Chinese characters, many of them convey meanings that are related to the book of Genesis,
Bill,
the creation story.
I heard a college professor one time was talking about letters that had been written to the Pope from the Jesuits that went to China to settle it for Christ, to go to the backward people, to bring them into a enlightened age. And this, in this letter to the Pope, the man was expressing how startled he was with the many parallels between the philosophy that the Chinese were teaching and the teachings of the Bible. And it was.
And there is a ceremony called the border sacrifice that was conducted twice a year by the Emperor of China, one at the northern border of China and one at the southern border of China on the not solstices. The summer solstice and the winter solstice. That was a bull sacrificed to the god Shangdi,
And it has a recitation that was quoted by Confucius over 500 years ago and documented going back 4,000 years. And the last one of those sacrifices was in 1911 when they deposed the last emperor of China.
Wow.
4,000 years of twice a year sacrifice. I'll tell you about it.
Okay. Well, let me go back to the question about Adam and Eve, because I think that one sort of has gotten swallowed in the process. And I would invite David or Lorraine or anybody else that wants to jump in on that one. From my vantage point, I see it as allegorical, but I do see the idea of Cain killing Abel as being an interesting reflection of the agriculturalists overthrowing the hunting and gathering peoples. And it seems to me that when you look back at the timing of cultural development, that is a fair analogy to draw to it. We have one indication that Adam means many, and the indication of who we married. To what extent are we dealing with the Neanderthals here? Across our church, I think you're going to find a wide variety of differences, but I think it's one of the things I like about our church is you don't have to agree about important issues like where we came from.
I will second that statement about, well, the church, the community of Christ is non-creedal. Almost paranoid about being non-creedal. So I have very close friend members, very brothers and sisters, who would look at the book of Genesis story as being the creation story of a tribe of the Hebrews, the Israelites. And as a story of a tribe, it's no more significant than the story of the Navajos have. It just happened to get picked up and the Christians grabbed it and used it. But they see it as no more significant than any of the other creation stories. In fact, one of them has even said the creation story of the scientist is really not that much more accurate because it's always changing. So that's one extreme. On the other extreme, I have very close friend members, brothers and sisters, who strongly believe that every word of the book of Genesis creation is literal. And there's not a single error in it. It happened exactly the way it's written. So what does the community of Christ believe? We believe in God and Jesus Christ. And then I start getting dangerous when I start saying, what do we as a church believe? We work as brothers and sisters to try to build, proclaim Jesus Christ and promote communities of joy, hope, love, and peace. That's what we believe in.
And that's what the Bible teaches.
Thank you, David.
If you do a word search in the Bible on the word believe, and you find everything that Jesus said about it, believe, you will find that there are only a few things that we are told that we must believe. We must believe that Jesus is the Christ. We must believe that he has the power. We must believe that he has the authority. We must believe that he was resurrected from the dead, that he died for us. Those are the things that the Book of Mormon says are important. Those are the things that Jesus said are important.
And it doesn't say anything about a virgin birth. It doesn't say anything at all about Trinity. Those things are other doctrines that other people have in their creeds that the Bible doesn't say a thing about. Maybe I should give a talk on that too.
The following Monday's available.
Jerry, would you like to respond?
I just want to say, yeah, that's interesting. I just didn't know what, how obviously the Utah branch LDS has very, is very structural doctrinally in a lot of areas. It sounds like Community of Christ isn't. I did have one question for Monty. He said he only owned one book. Can I assume that was a joke book?
Monty, it has to be.
I can remember in junior high school, the teacher walked up to my desk and confiscated my book of jokes. And I just reached down underneath my desk and picked up another book of them and started reading.
Well, that's two.
I'll tell you. But my problem was that I was using them as a weapon as much as anything else. And it was very derogatory in the way I applied them. And something that I regret to this day. But you wouldn't believe how I have gone to such great lengths to filter what comes out of my mouth anymore. And the reason it's such a problem is because I let it run free reign for so many years. And I just literally have to worry that I'm going to say something that I didn't really mean to say. And so it's part of a benefit, part of a curse. And I just try to do it because I try to lighten up the room a little bit. You guys are talking about some pretty heavy subjects, and I try my best to follow along. Sometimes I can, and sometimes it goes over my head. I guess I'm better at studying archaeologists than archaeology. But well, it's like I told you, I just couldn't dig it. But it's just one of those things that had to deal with.
Funny.
Okay, I wasn't asking for another joke, just a comment.
Lorraine's clapping her hands. Lorraine, you wanted you got on to speak? Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought you got on to respond to the Adam story. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're at 20 after 10, and some of us have to get up and dig tomorrow. I guess I'm the only one, huh?
Oh, well, I got to get up and go to work, so I'm not digging, but I do got to get up and go to work. But before y'all leave, I want to share something with you because I'm just knocked off my feet right now. So y'all know Rick Bennett, who's been with us. He was at World Conference for the Community of Christ. And Jerry, I've watched all of your things on Gospel Tangents, and they're very good, by the way. They're way over my head, but I've enjoyed them. So Rick asked me to do an interview. Okay, so we did an interview at World Conference. I am not a college educated person. I've never written a book. I thought he was crazy. Excuse me. But anyway, the video is now out today on Facebook. And Monty, you are mentioned, as is this forum, for having introduced us to each other. But Rick mentioned you because of your humor and what a special thing you bring to the forum. And I just wanted you to know that. So if you have Facebook and you can find Rick or find me, you'll be able to watch that. And then just now, I got a text from Stephen. hey, I saw your interview. It was really good. I need to talk to you. So I may be on another one. It's frightening.
Right.
So anyways, just wanted to share that.
Way to go, Deb Luz. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been sort of behind the scenes moderating here for 2.5 years, and here's somebody who recognized you and found out that you can speak too. That's great.
Yeah, thanks. And you know, I'm going through the Restored Covenant edition. I'm through more of it than I'm not. And it's making sense to me. Bye, Trevor. It's just, I'm really being blessed by the undertaking that Robert challenged me to read through it. And so I am learning things, surprisingly enough.
That's great.
That is one of the books I own, by the way.
Technical question for Deb. Deb,
Yeah.
can you put in the chat or email me how I can find you in Facebook? And having the link to the interview you made, thanks.
Okay.
Well, we're late enough. I think probably it's time for me to sing the song, and we will still have already had more than an hour on our recording, even by not having the presentation on it. So good night. The Lord is watching o'er you. Good night. His blessings go before you. Good night. And we'll be praying for you. So good night. May God bless you. Good night.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everybody, for a great discussion.
It has been delightful. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Lots of voices.